So yeah, thank you all for joining us for today's workshop on grant writing training and building your organization's narrative. We'll do a little bit of introduction of the project team, as well as everybody who's on the meeting here via the chat. Then I'll provide some content around Portland Clean Energy Fund as a whole, some basic background that you should know about the grant application process and some of the deadlines coming up. And then the majority of this workshop will be led by Darrell Kalika from Kaneem Associates, who we brought on board to help deliver some of this content and has a lot of background in grant writing and assisting nonprofits. So there'll be a basic kind of approach to grant writing and how to look at preparing materials, then some more content around building an organizational narrative, and really call out to some specific PCEF sections. And then we'll take a short break. This will also give us an opportunity to answer some initial questions that come up in this period before, as well as help you think of, or give you some time to think of additional questions. Then we'll have an example of kind of how to walk through elements of narrative building. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So yeah, again, thank you for being here, and go ahead and you can enter into the chat box, which you can pull up at the top or bottom of your menu. Put in your name, organizational affiliation, either who you work for or you're in a volunteer capacity, who you're volunteering on behalf of, and just one thing that you'd like to take away from the training. And so hopefully everybody should be able to chat with everybody publicly. So go ahead and you can start typing in there, and then we'll launch a poll in just a little bit as well to help get a sense as we're delivering this content of how familiar people are with applying for grants. And so we know that there's a range of different experiences that everybody has had. And this training is intended really for organizations that don't have a lot of experience applying for grants, but we hope that it can be useful for everybody on the spectrum. And a brief question that came up was that, yes, the recordings will be available on our website after these meetings, and you can also look at previous trainings and webinars that we've provided as well. And there'll be a link to that later on. All right, so I see some responses coming in, and then why don't we go ahead and also launch that first poll for the intro question. Janet, are you able to launch the poll?
Oh, sorry, I did not recall that was part of my piece. So sorry. Remind me where the poll, got it. Poll 1 is up. Launch the poll, and you should be seeing that now.
All right. Are people able to see the poll?
I'm seeing folks fill it out.
Okay.
Give it, yeah. We've got about 65% polled so far. We'll give it a little bit more time.
Great. And while that's up, I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then we'll introduce the project team. I see introductions on the chat are still coming in. So yeah, thank you all for being here. My name is James Valdez, and I use he, him pronouns. And I'm with the Portland Clean Energy Fund startup team as one of the staff members. I'll go ahead and pass it on to my colleague, Janet, next.
Good day, everybody. I am trying to get my video up, but in the meantime, I am Janet Hammer, and I'm delighted to be a member of the PCEF startup team and serving our community with this amazing initiative.
All right, and I'll go to Katie Lister. Oh, or if her audio isn't working, we'll go to my colleague, June.
Hi, everyone. My name is June Reyes. I'm a PCEF staff member, and I will be the one in charge of putting this video online. And so Great to be here with you all, and feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as this thing is going.
Great, thanks, June. And then, oh, Katie's fine.
Sorry, I figured out how to unmute myself. I've just had a slightly different setup than I usually do. I'm Katie Lister. I'm with the PCEF startup team, and I'm just going to be listening and kind of as a backup for the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Katie. And then, very importantly, I want to introduce our trainer today, Darrell Kalika.
Hi, everybody. I'm Darrell Kalika. I work with a number of different organizations, and I'm excited to provide the narrative building content today.
All right, great, thank you. And I actually can't see the poll, but I'm hoping, Janet, can you kind of read or share the results from the poll?
I can. I have hit the button that says sharing poll results. So I'm not sure why you're not seeing it, but yeah, so we have an interesting mix of folks here today all across the spectrum. So about 20% have never applied for a grant before. Just over a quarter have applied for somewhere between 1 to 5 grants previously. About 22% have applied somewhere between 6 and 10 grants, and some of you seasoned professionals have about 30% of you have applied for lots of grants, meaning 10 or more.
Great, thank you, Janet. And yeah, a real range on the spectrum here. And also thank you all for sharing and introducing yourselves via the chat. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of background of where we are now with the Portland Clean Energy Fund process. And I also want to note that some of this content and material is a little bit of repetition from content that you might have seen in webinars or other trainings, but we do want to provide a little bit of time for folks that aren't as familiar with PCEF, and also just note that we do have a lot of these resources and more in-depth information about the application process online through our webinars. So we're not going to go in great detail in this training. But really, we want to highlight that and express a lot of gratitude for all the work that was done back in November of 2018, almost 2 years ago, in passing the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which was the first environmental and climate initiative that was really led by and intended for communities of color, and is really an opportunity to change the narrative around climate work and climate justice. So there's been a lot of work in the last year and a half or so since the initiative passed. And the kind of key element is that there's a 9-person committee that is responsible for making decisions about the grant program structure, as well as for making the grant allocation. And so about a year ago, in November 2019, that grant committee was fully appointed and was on board. We then went through a series of different processes to develop the vision for Portland Clean Energy Fund, and did so in a way that really helped provide opportunities for community input and really co-building this together. And so that led to the development of guiding principles, which I'll talk about in a little bit, as well as public input on this grant application process and the scoring that we've made available for all of you to review. And so that all happened throughout this sort of spring and summer. You know, we've definitely had to make a lot of changes, as we all have, in responding to COVID, and recognize that this work is more important now than ever. So we were really excited about a month ago, in the middle of September, to be able to announce the launch of our first funding opportunity. Excuse me. And that is what you're all here to learn about today. So we are now in the process of providing some trainings and webinars to really get organizations ready to apply for funds by our deadline, which is November 16th. So we hope that you are already have looked at some of the material. I'll show you in a moment where to navigate that if you haven't. But applications for this round of funding are due November 16th, and then we'll go through review and selection process and scoring to help sort the awards, and then bring those in front of the PCEF Grant Committee, which will then make an allocation recommendation that then will go to Portland City Council with the goal of awarding the grants in February 2021. Throughout all of this, we'll then be also planning for the next funding round, which is a significantly larger funding round available in 2021. So when we look at the guiding principles or what's kind of behind the values of Portland Clean Energy Fund, really at the core of it is a focus on climate action that has multiple benefits and addresses both social and racial equity goals. And within that vessel, or kind of connected to that, is also guiding principles to be justice driven, to make sure that we're advancing change that is addressing historic and current discrimination, and that we're centering all disadvantaged and marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous people. There's also a strong commitment in our principles to be community powered, to really trust the community knowledge, innovation, experience, and leadership, and to really work on building and elevating both existing partnerships as well as capacity building for new emerging community groups and coalitions. And so these trainings are part of that. We were also able to offer previously, starting about a month and a half ago, an opportunity for capacity building small grants for small organizations, particularly those serving Black and Indigenous people. There's also a principle and vision within PCEF to be accountable, recognizing that these are public funds, and so we're ensuring that we're transparent, that there's oversight and public engagement processes that are allowing us to continue to learn as we roll out the program. So the next and a key critical piece is understanding who's eligible to apply for Portland Clean Energy Fund. And so many of you may be with different types of organizations, but the organizations that can apply are nonprofit organizations. And this is in the ballot initiative and code that voters passed back overwhelmingly in November 2018. And so organizations that can apply have to be IRS tax exempt, and they have to be active registered nonprofits with the state of Oregon. They also have to be not on a list of kind of bad actors. However, organizations can apply in partnership with other nonprofit organizations, for-profit businesses, or government agencies. So there is an opportunity for partnership and collaboration in a grant application. Also, if there's a small organization who isn't quite ready yet to be a full-on nonprofit, or a community group that's informal, organizations can apply through fiscal sponsorship. And so we do provide some guidelines and some opportunities to learn more about what fiscal sponsorship is, and some best practices around that on our website. So I wanted to talk about this particular funding opportunity that we have available now that is open until November 16th. And in this funding round, we have $8.6 million available in total funds. In future rounds and in future years, we anticipate having significantly more resources, between $40 to $60 million. And the allocation of that funding is something that, again, is we're reflective of the code and the ballot language that voters passed in 2018, which provides some general allocation and some areas of funding. And so those areas include about, in this round, between $3.4 to $5 million available for clean energy projects. And so this is things like renewable energy, solar energy, energy efficiency and weatherization projects that help reduce the energy use at places where people live, in their homes, places where people work or worship or learn. So there's an opportunity for improvements in buildings in different parts of our city and community. There's also an allocation for green infrastructure and sustainable agriculture. And this allocation in this round is between $840,000 to $1.3 million total. And is intended to really look at the ways that the things that are growing in and around our city help reduce carbon emissions and sequester carbon. So this can include things like street trees, planting bioswales or green roofs, as well as looking at ways that agricultural practices can reduce carbon emissions and help build a more resilient city. There's also an allocation for workforce development and contractor support, recognizing that there's a need to get a greater diversity of people into the clean energy jobs of the future and into our new green economy. And so this provides for opportunities involved in apprenticeship, workforce training, and job placement, particularly focused on priority populations that are people of color, low-income people, women, people with disabilities, and people who've had historic barriers to accessing employment. So those are the overall kind of structures. There's also a allocation and opportunity for innovation grants, recognizing that there are a lot of good ideas out there in the community that address both carbon emissions and social and racial justice, and that there's an opening to provide new ideas into that. So those are the funding areas. And then I wanted to talk about what are really 3 different types of grants that we have available that can be in any or multiple ones of those areas. So the first is that we have planning grants, and there's been an allocation of $1.5 million made for planning grants. And so these are grants that can be for up to $100,000 per application and are intended to take place over a single year. And our recognition that some organizations may not be fully ready to implement the project, but that they need additional resources to do community engagement, to do technical feasibility analysis, or to just further develop their program and project idea. And so this provides an opportunity for that exploration of a project and really further development for a future PCEF funding round. Then there are what we're calling project grants, which are building things or putting projects together, training people, activities that are fully implementation. And so there's $7.1 million allocated in this funding round for those. And there's 2 different types of project grants. There are small grants, which are those that are below $200,000 per application and are intended to take place over a period of up to 3 years. And then there's large grants, which are between $200,000 and $1 million per application and are intended to take place in a time period of up to a maximum of 5 years. And so as we go through the training today, you'll see that there's different requirements for those different types of grants between planning grants and then large and small project grants. And Darrell will speak to that in a bit. But I did want to provide a brief overview and navigation of where to find additional information. You may be here because you've already clicked through some of this, and we're really glad that you have. But for folks that haven't yet, we just want to make sure that you know where to find it. And so we do have a part of our webpage, which you can see the link to here, which really outlines all the different material that is in the grant application and a navigation of sorts of how to find the information you need for the type of grant that you're interested in. We also have additional webinars and technical assistance, one of which is this one today. And we encourage you to look at those resources. And also, if you're interested, you can look at the past recordings of those. I will note that we have 3 additional trainings related to grant writing coming up, but the content is going to be the same between the narrative building trainings that we offer, and then there'll be separate content with a little bit of overlap for the budget development trainings. But the content is mostly similar between budget narrative trainings, between the 2 budget narrative trainings we're doing, and the 2 grant narrative trainings that we're doing. So you don't need to attend all of the different workshops. You just need to attend one of each to get the full content. Then we also just recently added an open Q&A session that'll be taking place on Monday the 26th around the noon hour for people that have gone through all this content and have additional questions that they need some clarification on, or have questions about their approach to grant writing. We also, in the list of application resources, have some additional pieces that you might be interested in depending on what type of grant you're applying for. And so there are different requirements based on the subject area of your grant. And so this is some additional data and information sources to help you really get prepared. Again, you don't have to look at these, but they can help you if you need additional resources. So on that page, in terms of the mechanics of applying, you'll see that you can download all the documents as PDFs, and you can apply in different ways that I'll talk about in a moment. But there's some checklists that are available to help really guide you through what's required for different types of grants. So we do hope that you will look at all these requirements and understand also through this training what you need to do to get ready to apply. Then once you're ready to submit an application, we do have an application portal available online. And so this portal is something that is really intended to be entered into and logged into once you're pretty much ready to submit. It doesn't lend itself super well to collaboration between multiple people in the grant process. And so we encourage you to do that kind of document management in other tools like Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever your other tools are, and then to upload or to copy into the portal. However, if you don't want to use the online portal, that's totally fine as well. You can submit via email, just the list of attachments that are required for each type of grant, or you can even print them out and mail them. And I need to update the slide with our actual mailing address, but it is 1900 Southwest 4th Avenue with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And so again, they are due November 16th, and there's a lot of different ways to apply. But the application on the content that we have online really helps you navigate what's required, and that those requirements are the same regardless of how you choose to submit. So now I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Darrell, which she'll be able to walk us through the rest of the training and really some of the key content about how to approach grant writing, how to build your narrative as an organization. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Darrell.
Okay.
James and Darrell, just as you're passing over, there's one question that would be a clarifying question to address right now. Is there anything in the portal that we wouldn't find elsewhere ahead of time?
Oh, that is a good question. I believe back on this, in this kind of document library, all of these resources and information, this is the entirety of the content. So my understanding is that everything is here that would be on the online submission portal.
Yes, in fact, I think Darrell was going to mention, we absolutely encourage, recommend, suggest, and otherwise communicate that you'll be wanting to fill your materials out offline, and then the portal is just there to get the information in. So there won't be any surprises once you land on the portal.
Yes.
Great.
All right.
Okay. All
And
right.
just tell me when you'd like me to advance slides.
Okay, thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Darrell Kalika. I'm excited to be working with the PCEF team. And again, I'm kind of really just approaching this as this is one method in terms of the way that our company, Kaneem Associates, has, prepared grants, written grants, managing sort of the components of that. And, a lot of grant preparation is really information management and figuring out how you're going to structure things. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is just one method. There's, 360 different ways to approach this. And so I just wanted to offer that clarification. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. So what I'm really hoping to provide today is to kind of work with you and provide some information. And it's easy once you start looking at all the materials. It's a lot of information to go through, but also, keep in mind that you're applying or looking to apply because you have a vision that you'd like to accomplish. You have some objectives in terms of things that you're hoping to bring to your community, partnerships potentially being leveraged, and then ultimately, working on a funding goal in terms of your application. So it's an opportunity. This is the first time out with PCEF, so there's room there to consider things. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So again, like I said, applications for this particular funding opportunity, again, is really about information management and preparing to apply. As James already mentioned, I highly suggest that you go through and look at the information that's available on the PCEF website. It's really important to have, sort of a clear understanding of what the pots of funding that are there and understanding what they can be used for, and then sort of designing your project idea and concept. And then also taking into consideration, are you going to have some partners? Is there a fiscal sponsor that you're going to be engaging with regard to this application process? So taking that into consideration, there's a lot of moving parts to this. And so, just kind of thinking about it and really wanting to help demystify the application process for you all. And again, like I said, this is just one approach to doing this, but in terms of considering writing your application, you know, now is a good time to start getting sort of those files ready in terms of your access to an EIN, organic documents, your mission statement, just sort of having those all in an accessible place and file created on your desktop is probably the best place to start. And then keeping that file and documentation ready. It also kind of helps to, you know, feel like you're making some progress towards getting this application taken care of. And then the other piece is really kind of thinking about, you know, the submission process and preparing all of this information for submission. You know, November 16th is coming up fairly quickly. So just, you know, also putting together, you know, a timeline in terms of thinking about this. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So I presented this information kind of a linear format, and again, it's just another pathway to kind of demonstrate in terms of thinking about the application process. You know, one of the key things is, you know, thinking about how this particular funding opportunity sort of meets the needs of your community, your organization, you know, what is needed, and potentially thinking about small and large projects, but also, you know, consideration of maybe a planning grant as well. I can't emphasize enough thinking about eligibility, because it's one of those things that I tend to find gets a little circular at times with regard to thinking about organizational eligibility. And so really have a clear understanding of your organization's ability to meet these requirements. And in terms of that, I'm also thinking of that in terms of your fiscal sponsor. And if you're partnering with another organization, making sure that they meet the criteria for eligibility. And again, you know, thinking about reading the PCEF information. There's a lot of information that's accessible on the website, but it's really, I think, helpful for you to kind of go through and start really, you know, having a clear understanding of the materials, taking advantage of these particular workshops and webinars, and so forth. But I think the really critical thing is starting to think about developing a preparation plan. And by that, I'm thinking, you know, gathering the essential materials, taking a look at the actual information on the website, but also thinking about what do we need? What do we need to get this underway? And so I think the really key thing is to start to develop a timeline for yourself and some scheduling components to that. Like I said, participating in this webinar is one of those things that you could put on your timeline. We have a budget workshop that I also do. So just starting to think about the, you know, the management of the information, what you need to gather. And then I think the other key thing is that if you do have partners, you got to think about the logistics of those partnerships and what that's going to look like. You know, in terms of how are you going to engage each other. So for example, if you're partnering with a fiscal sponsor, you probably want to have a clear idea who the participants are going to be, who is on that team, and so forth. So I just want to take that into consideration. And, you know, so the larger the project, the more complicated it's going to be in terms of the demand for information. The timeline is going to be even more critical if you're looking at these the large project funding grants. I think you mentioned, James, it's five years in terms of the duration of the proposals. So there's a lot to take into consideration and having sort of a roadmap for yourself.
Just a quick note, they can be up to 5 years. They're not required. They're not required to be 5 years. They could be even as short as 6 months or something. But.
Okay. So just in terms of thinking of that complexity with regard to what you're trying to accomplish. So the one thing is, as we start looking at the narrative component, is, you know, beginning to outline the objectives that you're looking to accomplish with regard to your funding proposal. And this is really important because this is the opportunity to sort of, we all kind of come to this and we have an understanding of what it is that we're looking to accomplish, but also you need to take that into consideration of how you're going to explain that to the folks that are reviewing these proposals. And so sometimes, you know, we know what we're talking about, but in the process of developing your funding proposal, it's good to start, you know, and have a clear outline that's going to sort of take the reviewers step by step in terms of thinking about your actual proposal. So if we could go to the next slide. Another key thing to think about, and the narrative writing component and the budget component kind of go hand in hand. So there is a research component that goes into sort of informing the actual proposal itself and the narrative, but also part of that is you're using the narrative to inform kind of the decisions you're making within your budget as well. So there's going to be, you know, it's essential to gather information and sort of do that due diligence in terms of the information that you're presenting in the actual narrative, and making sure that you have you know, sufficient information to inform the proposal itself, the gathering data, whether you're looking at pricing and partnerships and so forth. So you're going to have to take some time to do some research and gathering information. And I think it's critical to also make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to draft the narrative and to address the components that go into the grant narrative itself. So I mentioned the budget again, just to reiterate, again, that's another webinar in and of itself, but I just want to make sure that I point that out, that again, the narrative component and the budget component do go hand in hand. Other things that, you know, you need to take into consideration with regard to preparation of the proposal itself is, are you going to have some board approvals that may be required? And those are sort of outliers that, you know, kind of depend on other people. Sometimes those schedules can add more time onto the timeline. So you're going to need to have maybe your leadership involved. Maybe you have to have board approvals. And if you are engaging with potentially a fiscal sponsor, what does that arrangement look like? Is that, you know, is that captured in a, you know, an MOU or an MOA, or is there a certain agreement that you have in place? So those are just kind of things to think about with regard to sort of those external components in terms of building your narrative and building your timeline. And then, you know, I'd like to also address the piece about submitting. I always kind of have this concern, and I'm sure some of you do. I think I saw some, you know, comments about anxiety over submitting your application. And it's totally normal to have some of that anxiety as you're getting ready to prepare your application and entering it into the portal system. And so give yourself plenty of time. Don't wait until the day up. Sometimes, you know, it's challenging because you have so many other considerations and people involved, but I'd say the sooner that you're able to get things ready to submit, do that. And then of course, you get to have the benefit of, once everything is kind of there, to submit. So, all right, we could go on to the next slide. So this is just an example in terms of thinking about your preparation plan. And these are kind of just dates that I put out there that I would be thinking about if I were getting ready to apply for the PCEF funding opportunity. One thing I think is really important, and I think it may have been mentioned by Janet as well, is, you know, it's not too soon to create a desktop file for your PCEF application. And in terms of that, you know, you're going to have iterations of drafts of components. You're going to have a draft of your narrative responses. You're going to have a draft of your budget. And then I think you're going to want to also create within your PCEF application file, things that are ready for submission. Those are the things that are final. Because it's easy to, you know, end up with multiple drafts and trying to keep track of where those things are. So I would definitely suggest, again, creating a file for yourself that may have, you know, subfolders in it for, like I said, the budget, final submissions, schedules, any of the PDFs that you're going to need, the checklists that go along with the grant, and so forth. But again, this is just kind of an example in terms of thinking about your preparation plan and getting ready to submit your narrative component. I'm taking a moment to just read the, okay. All right, so I think the other piece is now that you're kind of walked through that sort of timeline and sort of objectives, is getting ready to write your narrative. And this is that sort of bringing into alignment your project vision and goals in terms of how that aligns with the guiding principles of the PCEF funding opportunity. So let's go ahead and get started in talking about writing your narrative. Again, I can't reiterate how important it is to keep your vision in focus. You know, writing proposals and applications sometimes can get to be a little bit tedious. You're kind of, you know, is a bit of a wag the dog kind of a scenario. And just making sure that you're able to keep what it is that you're looking to accomplish in focus. And so I think answering sort of those key questions of, you know, what is that we're trying to do? Why are we doing this? When are we going to do it? Where are we going to do it? And who benefits from this? And how are we going to get it done? And of course, the other key piece is how much is this going to cost? So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So my goodness, that's really tiny. So what I've done here is kind of taken a look at the components for the different sort of buckets of funding that are in the PCEF application questions. And as you can kind of see from the planning project to a small project and large project, the information demand increases with each one. So there's 4 different sections in the planning project application. And of course, all of them have common components to them. For example, applicant eligibility is a requirement for the planning, small and large projects. The organizational information and financials, if I recall, I think that those are pretty similar to in each of the criteria. But as you can see, it starts to there's added more information as you continue down, going into section 3. You have a project description, scope, and your project team experience and qualifications. And then of course, there's a budget component to all of them. But where I, going through the materials, notice that there are added components for example, in the small project application, as you can see, let's see, section, that should say section 4. Section 4, you know, there's environmental benefits that need to be taken into consideration and are included in the application narrative. There's also social benefits that's in section 5. And then of course, there's section 6 has a workforce and contractor benefits. And so as you can see, that information kind of continues on into the large projects. So those are all different pieces and components. So as you're building your narrative file, you'll want to keep track of each of those sections and really take a look at them. So go ahead and let's advance. So again, this is just to kind of reiterate the demand for information with regard to the planning proposal and the small and large project proposal. Again, just illustrative of the types of information that's going to be needed, added level of detail and specificity. Then of course, there's the considerations for construction and non-construction requirements. And so yeah, I just wanted to just kind of, again, just give a visual in terms of consideration with regard to the narrative component. Okay, I think we can go ahead and, I feel like I'm going really quickly through these. Did we want to, where are we naturally going to be taking a break? I just wanted to check in.
Oh, we have a break scheduled kind of after, I'd say after maybe 7 or so more slides.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just going to take you kind of walk through this particular piece, which is the planning project sections. And so I just basically kind of went through and did sort of a quick outline of what is included in the planning project application section. And again, it's got the applicant eligibility. There are 18 questions in that particular section. And again, it's really kind of just the profile of your organization, sort of the demographics, tax and business information, fiscal sponsor. It's really just that first section is to describe your organization in terms of eligibility. And then section 2 starts to get into more of the details about your organization. So again, there's 8 questions there. And I'm just really kind of just pointing out, just kind of breaking the application process down into sort of these more bite-sized pieces. Thinking also about the project description and scope and your project team experience and qualifications. And then of course, there is the project budget. But again, that's a wholly separate webinar in terms of conversation about the budget. So we can go ahead and advance. So I don't want to belabor it too much, but just to kind of give you an example of, you know, what the application section 1 looks like. This is the section 1 narrative components, just to give you sort of a flavor of what it is in terms of what you're responding to, description of your organization. And again, these are kind of information that you probably would want to populate in a Word document in a separate file, and creating part of that application file that I described earlier in terms of some of your folders and so on and so forth. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, this is pretty much just kind of cut and pasted pieces of the narrative questions for the planning grant. And this is sort of section 2, which is more of the description about your organization, sort of describing your financials and so forth. So again, I just kind of wanted just to give that sampling and flavor, and, you know, kind of get you in the mind space of thinking about what the actual narrative questions are, what that looks like. I did want to mention too that there is a word count there, but in talking with the folks on the PCEF team, that those are really sort of guidance, you know, guidelines. They're not as, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, James, but they're not hard and fast in terms of, you know, meeting that minimum or maximum numbers. But I just wanted to kind of point that out to you, because there are different word counts in the different sections. So just kind of just highlighting that for you. All right, we could go to the next slide.
Maybe if I could just add a little bit of extra content. Yeah, you're absolutely right about those the word counts are just guidelines, but their proposals won't be scored positively or negatively if they go above or beyond, or below or above those. They're just merely for guidance. Just kind of another note that really kind of looking at questions like 2.4, the proposed project beneficiaries and who's intended to benefit is a piece where, you know, that's an opportunity to tell your story of what you've done, but also what you intend to do. And that's a really key part of the kind of elements of the narrative, of articulating whose lives are going to be made better by the project that you're doing. Also, just noting that there's a lot of points given in the scoring criteria, which are available, and you can map the application to the scoring criteria as part of those materials that we have available. And there's quite a bit of points given to the connection between the organization itself and the demographics of the organization and who the organization serves, and looking for alignment between the people doing the work and the people being served. And so that's, again, just something to look at as you build your narrative and be able to tell your story about how your organization provides services and prioritizes different populations. So just wanted to give that extra flavor.
Great.
And then I will.
Okay. All right, continuing on into the next section. Again, this is still talking about the planning grant or the pot of funds and available for the planning component. And this is really, I think, that the opportunity now to start describing your project scope and looking at the project description. And this is that chance to, in addition to telling your organization story, this is the chance to start telling the story about the intent and project design for your project. And this is probably one of those places where you're going to want to spend quite a bit of time. As you can see, it's the word count there is greater. Again, just as a guideline in terms of thinking about how much time you want to spend. I like to see those word counts because then it tells me a bit where I need to spend my time in terms of informing and populating these particular responses. And so, it's already kind of put in there into a sort of a nice outline already there. You have, I think you have 5 components right there to look at. And so just kind of taking that into consideration as you're preparing your narrative. So this is where it starts to come together in terms of informing the folks that'll be reviewing the proposals. Okay, we can continue to the next slide.
Well, maybe just one more piece is that that last note about attachment A is that for different types of projects, there are, but this isn't as much of an element in the planning grants, but for different types of projects, there are different elements that are addressed depending on whether it's addressing energy efficiency or green infrastructure, or so just make sure you look at those, especially if you're looking at a project grant, a smaller large project grant. Look at those additional attachments and questions that are there.
Okay. Okay. And again, looking at the information, again, this is just the same visual that was I provided earlier, but just to reiterate again, the amount of information in response to the applications in particular sections. So we can go ahead and skip ahead or move to the next slide. So I do want to take some time to walk through some of the sections that are there for the small and large project application components. And again, as was previously mentioned, that this is that time to tell your story. And I think that each of these sections is illustrative of the opportunity to tell a story. Okay, let's go ahead because this is really kind of just to inform. So what I've done here is kind of taken, so we went through the planning proposal piece, now we're into the project component. So I just kind of wanted to offer, again, some information here with regard to the added sections that are in the small and large project proposals. So for example, taking a look at the narrative questions for the small and large grant, and this is section 4 on environmental benefits intro. And so taking a look at that in terms of consideration about how your project aligns with the sort of the PCEF objectives. Taking a look, as you can see, for the impacts with regard to climate change, taking into consideration other components. Does the proposed project consist solely of activities that are not physical improvements, but are potentially workforce development? Maybe there is that added component of education, training, and so on and so forth. And then so taking a look, again, just to be, this is more illustrative in terms of thinking about the components of section 4. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, and again, taking into consideration, these are added sections for this particular point. It's on the social benefits and intro with regard to that. It's already kind of structured in terms of an outline, in terms of responses. Does the project consist of activities that are not necessarily physical? Okay, and then cost savings, considerations, what cost will be saved, energy utility bills, food costs, transportation. Again, this is a chance to kind of tell those social benefits part of the story in terms of what you're looking to accomplish, priority populations, and again, just the opportunity to get a little more specific with regard to describing the social benefits of your actual project proposal. So let's go ahead. We can go on to section 6. So I think in the next slide.
Thanks, and also just wanted to highlight something that Janet put in the chat that you'll see throughout the application is that if a section does not apply to the type of grant that you're seeking to do, then there's really, you can skip through certain sections, and that navigation is provided in the application documents as well as in the portal. And so depending on the type of grant that you're applying for, some of these may not need to be filled.
Okay, and then again, this is for the small and large grants, and this is section 6 on workforce and contractor benefits. And let's see this, yeah. Again, I'm just kind of providing this information to you so you can take a look at what those requirements are for section 6. I don't know if there's anything more you want me to say about this, James, or if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, this is an opportunity to just talk about who is intended to be doing the work, if that's already been identified by your project. And there's more detail required for large grants and grants that are over $200,000. And then there's different thresholds of specificity required for projects that involve construction over a certain amount. I believe that threshold is $350,000. And so just look at that as you're putting together both your project budget as well as your narrative, because you'll have to provide more information the larger the dollar value is of the construction activity related to the grant. And so there are, for small grants, not really an expectation necessarily that all your contractors will be arrived at or that you have selected those already as you're putting together a project. But there's more details required for the large grants, and especially as you get into the higher dollar value. And so those thresholds, again, are laid out on the application materials. But this is an opportunity for you to tell that story of how are you building a workforce that is diverse and inclusive as you implement your project, and what goals do you have as a project, but also how are you going to meet the requirements that we have as Portland Clean Energy Fund. And this is an element where we do provide some clear guidance about for instance, wage requirements associated with PCEF funds in general, and then also related to what you see there kind of in the slide, is that there is a requirement for prevailing wage and apprentice programs for those that are over $350,000 worth of construction activities. So yeah, there's a lot in here if you're applying for a large dollar value project that has construction activities. and any of my colleagues feel free to weigh in there. I did want to, we're about to go into a brief break and Q&A, or a brief break, so I wanted to provide an opportunity to answer a question. There was a question from Jennifer Breedlove of, can a grant be applied for to provide individual grants towards a product that is sustainable, environmentally conscious, and supports BIPOC workforce? So I'd say there's opportunity definitely within the innovation fund or innovation grant structure to help support things that have both a climate reduction and also a social and racial equity goal. Manufacturing of a product in and of itself, I think would have to be, again, applied for with a nonprofit partner who was playing a key role in helping implement that. And so that may, again, we have to be a little careful about not providing any specific guidance on grant proposals, but since you brought up kind of the element of workforce training, that may fit better within workforce training. I hope that answers your question. We have a couple more. Question from Leslie of, are milestones a timeline of implementation of the scope of work? And the answer is very much yes, that the milestones are an opportunity for you as an applicant to articulate how much time total you'll need for your grant. And so this is where you can select, you know, let's say if you're applying for a small grant of less than $200,000, it could be up to 3 years, but it could also be a year and a half. And so this is an opportunity for you to articulate the needs of your project in terms of timing, as well as some of the key elements of success or timeline of how that project will roll out. Also, of course, know that as part of Portland Clean Energy Fund, we'll have reporting requirements that will be part of a grant agreement that the successful grant recipients sign. And so there will be regular quarterly reporting as well, that then will be tied to the grant agreement and the milestones that you've applied for. And there is, of course, some flexibility. We recognize that, you know, there's changes that happen in project implementation. But yes, to answer your question definitively, those milestones are the timeline. Let's see, additional questions from Suzanne Roderick Casals is that $350,000 threshold that I mentioned is related to a single site. And yes, the answer is that for this round of funding, and I don't want to make any promises about future rounds, but for this round, the threshold for prevailing wage and also for kind of the additional reporting elements is $350,000 on a single site for construction, for the construction budget associated with that site. And let's see. Oh, and I'm actually seeing some, so Janet is answering some of the questions in the chat as well.
But Joshua Baker's question is still in the chat.
Yep, and I'm just going to read the answers, even if they're in the chat, just so that people have a full record, especially online, if they're viewing this recording, because the chat won't be saved, or it may not be saved exactly with it. So there's also a question from Greg Haar, a clarification of whether small projects have the prevailing wage requirement, or the 180% of minimum wage, and wanted to kind of separate those two, because prevailing wage is a separate element related to certain trades in the construction industry. The 180% of minimum wage is a PCEF programmatic requirement for all employment related to PCEF. And so those are kind of two separate things. The prevailing wage, again, applies for projects with over $350,000 of construction costs at a single site, but all PCEF projects must abide by the 180% of minimum wage. let's see, a question from Joshua Baker of, is there an exhaustive list of what is eligible for green infrastructure grant? And they're thinking of a small park redevelopment. There is some guidance of what types of projects are eligible within the grant application materials, but broadly, I guess I would think of whether or not there's climate emissions reductions associated with that. If it's a project purely for kind of beautification, I'd say it might be harder to make that case, but green infrastructure is something that, you know, is an evolving field as well. And so there's an opportunity, I think, for a range of projects, but there's not a like yes, no checklist that we've developed of what constitutes green infrastructure. And so let's see, it's a little after 1. I think we will take a brief break and continue putting your questions in the chat. We're going to prioritize questions that are more kind of clarifying questions about the process. And then we'll hold some of the questions till the end, which I believe we'll have quite a bit of time for Q&A. So it's now 1:05. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 1:10. All right, hope everybody got a little bit of a stretch break or water break, whatever you needed. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it back to Darrell here in just a moment. and I should have actually had this slide up this whole time. Sorry. But also wanted to answer a question that did come up from Leslie, clarifying question of whether they can apply for 2 separate small PCEF grants for the same site. Applicants are welcome to apply for multiple grants in the same funding round. That's totally okay. I guess the guidance that we would provide is that the work done should be distinct on each application. So shouldn't be the same body of work happening in 2 different applications.
James, this is Janet here. And just to clarify, if you were thinking your project includes both regenerative agriculture and some weatherization and maybe even workforce, you don't have to submit 3 different applications. So if it's all for the same project, and it really is the same project, it's 1 application and you'll check the box that notes which of the funding categories you're applying for. But if you've got, like, I'm going to build, you know, something, as James said, like something that's distinct and like, well, we might apply for this thing over here, and that's distinctly different and could proceed without this other part being funded, then that would be two separate applications.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. That is a really important clarification, that you can apply for a single grant that covers multiple topic areas. And I hope that answered your question. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Darrell, who she'll walk us through an example of a project that wasn't a PCEF project, but talk through how a similar type of project or a how one might approach writing a PCEF grant based on a tangible example.
Okay. Excuse me. Thanks, James. And pardon me, I've got a bit of a cold, so I have to take some breaks to catch my breath. So, so as James described, so if we could actually advance past this slide. Okay. And let's continue, advance past this one as well.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right, so this is the example. And again, this was not for PCEF, but I was using it as an illustrative example of how one particular project that I worked on, and if I were to think about, you know, just to provide this example, what we were looking to do was to build an energy efficiency network for tribal housing. And this was specifically working with tribes in Oregon and Washington and helping support sort of an effort, because energy efficiency is not necessarily accessible to all tribal communities. And so what we were looking to do was to start to build some capacity around energy efficiency, specifically for residential facilities. So with regard to kind of thinking about this project, what we were looking at was doing some community outreach and capacity building, specifically with tribal communities, tribal leaders, and housing departments as well, and starting to create some infrastructure within tribal housing around energy efficiency. So one of the requirements was also, in addition to just sort of getting people more informed about opportunities for energy efficiency, there was also a need for training. So we started working on, you know, planning different training events, specifically in Oregon and Washington. And so this particular example is one in terms of what we built was a training. So we had to hire some folks to come and deliver training. We were thinking about offering it to about 60 folks, and I think we had a total 61 people that were involved. And then the next piece was to help work with some of these folks in terms of thinking about how they would design an energy efficiency effort. And ultimately, our goal was to you know, help people identify potential projects that they might look for to develop, and possibly also kind of help steer them to partners and so forth for for grants, for funding opportunities. So why don't we go ahead and advance to the next slide. So when I was thinking about working on this particular example, and again, I'm just using it for illustrative purposes in talking about how to sort of provide some inspiration around drafting your narrative, is as I mentioned earlier, that the budget and the narrative really do go hand in hand. And so, being able to consider and think about how you're going to tell that story, both in terms of utilizing the narrative, but also number-wise, how does that story get reflected in terms of the budget? And so there's quite a bit of work that kind of goes into the process of developing the narrative and the budget component and doing quite a bit of research. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So for the example project, so I'm going to just provide a little bit more context in terms of what the narrative component and developing that narrative kind of looked like, as I was kind of outlining for this particular project example. So as I mentioned, we had kind of 3 components to this project. And I just kind of wanted to break it down into sort of bite-sized pieces as I started to, develop and tell the story of what it is that we're going to do, who's the benefactors of this particular project, who's going to be involved, and kind of what we're doing at each phase of this particular project. So I'll just kind of walk you through in terms of thinking about, sort of formulating a project in terms of developing an outline for a narrative. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it's keeping a clear vision in terms of understanding what it is that you're looking to accomplish. And so, like I said, the first part of our project was really to do some community outreach and engagement and starting to develop sort of increased network around energy efficiency, providing resources. Energy efficiency was a wholly new thing, so we had to reach out and find different partners to work with, in just, getting more familiar with different organizations, working with utilities that are out there, and then other sort of like utility supported programs. So we also had to do some leadership development in terms of finding those kind of point people out there that are working in this space and who'd be willing to take on sort of this effort. And so just kind of thinking about, what does that entail? I mean, how do you build that sort of leadership, and how do you build capacity, and starting to sort of map that out in terms of being a resource to support folks. So then just kind of getting into sort of, project into the next step, which was to provide training. We had to kind of sit down and really sort of, at the beginning, think about what will our training look like? Who are we going to engage to help provide some of this information? Who are the resources that are out there, and how many people are we hoping to attract for this training, and will be served from this particular event? And then in the process of doing that, also thinking about some of the sort of technical assistance and the peer-to-peer support that is out there. And, we didn't actually go into this with regard to thinking about specific deliverables, but just naturally, one area that kind of stood out for most folks was around heat pump installation. That's not something that we anticipated when we were going into the project. It just was sort of a secondary benefit that came out of that sort of peer-to-peer support. And then the last thing we did was we wanted to identify, a group of 1 to 3 tribes that we could help, identify some funding opportunities, help provide some TA for technical assistance for grant writing and support, and just kind of very similar to this. I mean, it's, it's a wholly new endeavor. And so we just kind of wanted to just kind of, again, using this as an illustrative example of a project in terms of developing the narrative for this. So we can go on to the next slide. So there were, as I mentioned, there were 3 components in terms of, actually we wanted to do 3 trainings. We were doing 1 for Oregon, 1 for Washington, and then we kind of had a catch-all training that we wanted to do as well. But I'm just kind of pointing this out to you as an example. This is a slide I pulled over from the budget workshop, but I just wanted to kind of use this to kind of show in terms of thinking about, how you start to link the narrative with the budget component. And so, yeah, very, very granular. This is all, this information is really kind of for our working, kind of that informed working file. It's not something that's required for the PCEF grant. I'm just using it as, again, just to kind of just provide an example in terms of how, I think about preparing the budget and using the narrative to explain what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Again, as I mentioned, that one of our activities was to provide training. So this is just kind of a budget for what the actual training looked like, whose time is there. I have like paying for the executive director's time. We had to hire a contract training team to do energy efficiency training because that's not something that we have internal capacity to do. So it was a whole new thing. Other costs, like the venue, the training venue, consideration for things like food and catering. We're wanting to provide, coffee and so forth for 60 people that we are hoping will show up to this training. Additionally, things like training materials, those sort of costs that you're going to have to think about and plan out. We provided a travel stipend for folks. As well as some of the travel, paying for, like I said, our executive director to participate and provide opening comments. So again, this is just kind of to get you thinking about, how the budget relates to the narrative. And just again, for purposes of this being an example, I also, I have all those sort of task and budget items. Sort of as we're going into this planning, because you hope that you can estimate for what you will need, and then I have a column in there for actuals. Should the funding proposal get accepted, you're going to have to keep track of those sorts of things for reporting. So I don't think it's ever too early to kind of start thinking about how you'll populate your files. And then just again, for the purposes of just this being an example, the project categories actually are similar to what's offered in the PCEF grant. But again, I don't want to confuse it too much. I'm just, again, using this previous example of a project I worked on and how, how you can translate that into the preparation of a grant. So, okay, we can go ahead to the next slide. So again, I just wanted to sort of reiterate the components that are a part of the application process itself. And again, I've gone through and I've kind of highlighted there for you in this example, the sections that relate to the PCEF application questions. And then again, kind of thinking about as you're preparing your files and so forth is to have your sort of final PCEF narrative file. And so this is just kind of an outline of that, but then also thinking about as well, the budget component. Again, the example I used is really to help sort of inform how you populate the worksheet on the PCEF budget. So yeah, so I hopefully I'm not adding more confusion I'm just trying to demonstrate to you kind of how I work in terms of preparing similar types of grant applications and the thought process that kind of goes into that, and kind of thinking about all the sort of links in the chain of information that's required for a particular application. So, okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, I think we have some opportunity for Q&A. Maybe also as just a wrap up, that we will have another webinar specifically on budget development, but it's important, as you're building your project idea, to think about how much money you need, because that does inform whether you're going for a large or a small grant. And your narrative should tell a story of how you plan to do the activities But where there is a strong linkage between the budget and the narrative, but we're not asking for that much detail in the budget. And so, Darrell mentioned that, but we're not asking for itemized lines of individual materials or staff time in that level of detail. But we have another training on that. Yeah, I'd say overall we have some opportunity and time here, still about a little over half an hour left if people have questions about either the grant approach and some tips from Darrell about how to approach grant writing, or specific questions that are more clarifying in nature about the PCEF requirements and application process. Feel free to raise your hand or type it in chat, either way. So. Not seeing any yet, but.
So James, I would offer too, just kind of in consideration of just grants and applications, I think this particular application is pretty guided in terms of, the types of questions that are being asked, which is not, is fairly, uncommon in terms of the grant applications I've seen before. Some, particularly when I'm looking at sort of foundation grants or say Department of Energy grants, they tend to be sort of these kind of chunky blocks where you kind of have to fill in the blanks. So, but I just wanted to say that, there's the way that the application itself is structured lends itself, I think, really, really well to being user friendly, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. And we do have a question that came up that I think is, a good one for you in general with grant writing from Allison, of what are common mistakes or oversights in narratives that we should watch out for.
So, and now let me offer it this way. So I forgot to mention, so I'm an attorney by training. So when I started writing grants, I started writing them from the perspective that these could become potential in pieces of information for a funding agreement. And so when I'm writing, narratives, I'm always trying to be very careful about, making sure that I'm fully explaining things even down to sort of a granular level, and always make sure that you're answering the questions that are asked. I think that's really important, and providing as much information as possible, but also in a concise way. So I always like to make sure that every sentence I'm writing needs to be there. And so those are some things I think of in terms of when I'm planning and writing out my narratives, and not, having sort of unnecessary verbiage in there, making sure that everything that's supposed to be in there is there. So.
Kind of a related question. Can you tell us some pitfalls to avoid when writing a narrative? I guess one I would think of is not that I would reflect on in my own life would be just not allowing enough time to develop it, and more around proofreading and having somebody else also read it. But Darrell, do you have some tips as well?
I do. One thing I do find helpful, you're right, is making sure that you give yourself plenty of time. And also, when I first started writing grants, I was asking for help from a lot of different folks that I knew had written grants before. I always find it really helpful to have at least somebody else take a look at what I've written to say, kind of do that check. Does this make sense? Am I leaving stuff out? Did I miss something that, and again, part of it is that proofreading. If you're rushing and you look at it later, oh no, I misspelled things, or I, had grammatical errors in there. So yeah, I think it's really giving yourself enough time to spend in responding to the questions that are being asked.
Great, thanks, Ralph. And I see Jennifer Breedlove's hand raised, and go ahead and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just wanted to clarify something just to make sure I'm understanding it right, that the planning grant is still available to apply for. And if it is still available, how is that a completely separate process than like the innovation grant that was talked about earlier?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And yes, the planning grant opportunity is open with the same deadline of November 16th, and it is one of 3 types of grants that we're offering. So there's planning grants, which are up to $100,000, and then there's 2 types of project grants, small and large grants. And the application for the planning grants is a lower bar in terms of the information required, because you're not expected to already, have your project fully developed. And so, yes, those are available, and there is $1.5 million of funding allocated minimum for those planning grants. So we do anticipate that we'll see quite a few proposals for planning grants. And yes, absolutely, those are open this round.
Okay, and then there's someone else I had another question too, but it looks like someone else had that in the chat about partnerships. And
yeah, go ahead and ask your question. It's fine.
So the one part that I wanted to add to their question that they have about partnerships is that how many partnerships can you have? Is there a minimum? I mean, not a minimum. Is there a maximum amount of partnerships?
There's not. And also to answer or to read off that question, the question that we had was, if we have a partner but it's not a fiscal sponsor, should we weave information about that partner into the narrative? I didn't see any specific questions about partnerships. And that, yeah, both your question and Leslie's are excellent. There's no maximum number of partnerships. There's an opportunity in the narrative to talk about your kind of key, the key people involved in your project. And so that can be as long or as short as you need it to be. And so, I'd say that even if you have multiple partners, you probably do want to, multiple partner organizations, you probably want to be able to speak to kind of a couple of the key people in that organization and their skills to be able to add them to kind of the project team elements of the narrative. So I hope that helps, but there's not any maximum number of partners. And there's a difference too between fiscal sponsorship and partnership, as was noted, where fiscal sponsorship is really intended for small organizations that could be nonprofits or just small community groups, but that themselves are not either at a place in their own capacity to apply for a grant in terms of the administration and elements of grant management, or they may not yet have 501c3 or 501 nonprofit status. And so fiscal sponsorship is an opportunity in particular to help smaller organizations be able to implement a project with the assistance of a larger eligible nonprofit. But really, if it's a business entity or another organization that's playing a contractual role in a project, that is really more of a partnership. And so there is a distinction there I want to make for folks. And also just a helpful note from Janet, my colleague, is that there are additional resources available from the Nonprofit Association Oregon, also known as NAO, which has additional trainings available for nonprofit organizations to build their capacity and help apply for grants. And they've had a shift in their model over the past few months with COVID, and really made a lot of their resources available and trainings available for free. So, there are additional resources out there for organizations if you're looking for additional tools. Let's see. Another question from Angela is, asking the partnership question from another angle, can my organization be a partner on multiple grants? And the answer to that is yes. A organization can be a partner on multiple grants, and a nonprofit organization could also apply for a grant and then also be a partner on a different grant. And so, yes. Let's see, an additional question that came in that I'll post in the group chat, just a moment, because it wasn't sent to everybody. The question was, would a clean electrified transportation project be eligible under the clean energy category? This is a great question. And I think the answer that we have at this point is largely that electrified transportation opportunities are definitely a key part of carbon reduction and climate mitigation. The ballot initiative didn't specifically call out transportation as part of the kind of definition of clean energy, but there is a role for transportation related projects in PCEF. And so I'd say, they could also be considered under the innovation side of PCEF funding. If one of my colleagues wants to jump in with more clarification or more detail, feel free to, but. And Janet, did you want to make a comment?
I know there's some overlap between narrative and budget, and so I just was going to share a clarifying question about that level of detail that we were referencing a bit ago. When you're filling out your budget form, there's not that nth degree of detail about 25 people times $6 per meal times whatever. You don't need to put that level of detail into what's submitted. But at some point, you needed that level of detail to come up with what the grant request was about. And so I think going back to some of the elements that Darrell laid out for us, there's a spot where you're talking about what I want to do, and you break that down into what are the specific activities and steps, and who does that, and what are the costs to do that. And there's categories. Is that personnel? Is that a contractor? Is that going to be food and whatnot? So you're thinking that through at that level of detail to be able to answer those questions, to be able to fill out that budget narrative. But when you enter that, you're not having to share that level of detail, if that is helpful or makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And I see that a few people have had to leave, and that's totally cool. We do have a little bit more time, and I wanted to put up an exit poll that we have. So if you do have to leave, go ahead and Janet, if you could pop up the exit poll, and then people can just fill that if you have to leave early.
You should be seeing it now.
Great, thank you. But yeah, we still do have some time for Q&A. And again, if we can't answer your question definitively right away, we will post an answer on the website. So look for that every Wednesday. We're posting new answers to Q&A to questions that we receive throughout the week. So yeah, we do have a little bit more time though. Folks have additional questions or are looking for additional grant writing tips from Darrell. All right, feel free to put in questions or raise your hand. If we don't have any coming in by let's say 1:45, then we will go ahead and wrap up the meeting a little early. But,
And don't be shy. Darrell's been
Yeah.
at this for
Yeah.
quite some time, and this is your time to think about, as you're writing the narrative and complements the budget, anything that you think someone who's got that experience under her belt, feel free to, there's no wrong question or silly question. We know a lot of folks are new to this, so don't be shy.
All right, still see a few people left. Yeah, feel free to, this is a great opportunity to get questions answered. I'm realizing that even a minute of silence is a pretty long time. Maybe we'll go for 140.
One just came in here.
Oh, perfect. Yes,
Can you
save us.
submit a planning grant and a small project grant in the same funding cycle?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mark. And the answer is yes. You could submit for a planning grant and a project grant in the same funding cycle, where we're not making organizations pick between one of the two. Again, I'd say that there probably should be some substantive difference between the two, and there would be more detail required for a small grant. And so if you have multiple project ideas, it's fine to apply for a small grant to implement a project while still developing a project idea and doing additional community engagement or research through a planning grant on a different idea. Yeah.
This is Janet. I'll share one other thing. It's just, someone was talking about building their confidence here. Just always remembering that kind of that North Star. PCEF was created to advance climate action that centers equity and triple bottom line benefit. So, you're starting with that question. Do I have a project idea for something that is a fit for PCEF and those goals? And if you're working on that application and you realize, oh, there's more here that I'm not quite sure about, then maybe don't apply for your small grant or your large grant. Maybe you need a little more time to work on fleshing things out, and a planning grant makes sense. And remember, this is just year one, and there will be future opportunities to apply. So just to take that pressure off of yourself, it might be a couple other things that might be helpful to you.
Mhm.
All right. I realized I had one more thank you slide. And yeah, we do have a little bit more time, or if not, then I think we'll wrap up a little bit early and give you back 15 or so minutes of your day. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope this has been useful. And yeah, again, we have additional training opportunities, more details and webinars coming up. But again, the content from this grant narrative writing will be the same as grant narrative writing training that will be on Monday. So you don't need to attend both. And yeah, thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, great.
All right, take care.